Great. Thank you. All right. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you. Welcome back to our second part. You just have me tonight. Rabbi Somson is in Israel. Actually, he's in flight right now. Well, he's probably taking off soon. So he is unexpectedly going to Israel with a group of educators. So it's just me tonight. All right. And we are going to pick up where we left off, and we want to cover. Look, I want to say I'm aware that this is like really what we need is a deeper dive into Israeli history, Zionist history, and sit tight. That might be coming, but for now, we're just going to continue to give sort of the highlights, the important dates. Last week, I think we spoke about Kishinev, and we spoke about the Balfour Declaration and the events leading up to 1948, the vote for partition in the UN and what that meant. And I want to pick up post 48, and we want to hit a couple significant dates tonight. Number one, I want to talk about just what happened in the immediate aftermath of 1948. I want to talk about the Six-Day War. We'll talk about the Yom Kippur War, and we'll talk about the emergence of Hamas. By the way, we'll talk about Oslo, and then we'll talk about the emergence of Hamas. That might sound ambitious to you, but we will try our best to get through it. And then we'll try to bring it up to current times a little bit. Okay, so that's the plan, and we'll try to leave questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll go from there. And look, I'm happy to if we need a third week, we'll get a third week, but we'll do our best to get through some of this. Okay, so I'm just going to ask everybody to continue to stay muted, just because there's always a little bit of background noise when people aren't muted. And if you have a question and we call on you, then you can unmute yourself. So I'm going to mute everybody. And okay, so I think we're good. All right. So I want to, look, we're talking about these big moments, right? Like 67, 73, Oslo. But I do just want to frame the fact that, you know, that there is a nation to be built after 1948, right? And there's just the things that have to happen that will enable a state to exist. And one of those is elections, right? That post 48, right? So Israel declares statehood. They are attacked, by lots of armies. They end up sort of winning this phase of the War of Independence, and then there is a state of Israel, and then comes the business of building a Jewish state, of building a government, of building a country. And I don't know, I forget what we said in terms of book recommendations, but to me, still one of the best books about the history of Israel is Danny Gordis's book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. By the way, it's not so concise, right? But it is a great, great book that tells the story of the birth of Israel. And I want to just share with you a little bit of what Gordis writes about. I'm going to call it the day after, but it's not really the day after. It's actually several months after. And that is on January 25th, 1949. Israel had been an independent state for 8 months. And on January 25th, 1949, with the war essentially over, Israel held its first elections. Okay. Now, I want you to imagine, right? Like to us, you know, elections feel like, okay, we have elections all the time, right? Like, what's so, I mean, yeah, we vote, we think it's a civic duty, et cetera, et cetera. But I want you to imagine that it had been 2,000 years since Jews had had a sovereign nation. 2,000 years. And the symbolism of the elections was incredible. So I want to tell you, and I want to read a little bit about one particular rabbi named Rabbi Moshe Yekutiel Alpert. Moshe Yekutiel Alpert was an ultra Orthodox rabbi who had served as the leader of several Jewish communities in Jerusalem during the British Mandate. All right, and this is what he says. All right, and I find this to be, you know, in some ways, um, I think that the election is as miraculous as any you know, war victory, right? The fact that the simple acts of building a Jewish state after 2,000 years of exile is incredibly significant. So this is what Rabbi Moshe Yekutiel Alpert says. The time is 5:35 a.m. I woke up. My wife, and my brother, Rabbi Shimon Leib, and my brother-in-law, Rabbi Nathaniel Seldovan, and my son Dov. After drinking our morning coffee, we dressed in our Sabbath attire in honor of this great and sacred day, because, and he quotes the Psalms, Zeh hayom aseh Adonai nagila v'nismecha bo, that this is the day that the Lord created. We should be happy and rejoice. Because after thousands of years of more of exile, that since the 6 days of creation, we've never been blessed with such a day to be able to go and vote in a Jewish state. Blessed is the one who has kept us alive, sustained us, and brought us to this time. He recited the Shehechianu. He finished his coffee. He's got his identity card, and he arrives at the polls at 6 in the morning. And, he says that he walked along as if he was carrying a Torah on Simchat Torah. He was the first to arrive, and he's handed a card on which, along with his name, was stamped the number 1. Imagine that you're the first person to vote, right? And then I experienced, he said, the holiest moment of my life, a moment that my father and grandfather were not privileged to experience. Only I in my lifetime was privileged to be at such a holy and pure moment. Happy and blessed am I, happy and blessed is my portion. I made the Shehechianu, and I deposited the envelope in the ballot box. Only after he voted did Rabbi Alpert, who normally began his day with morning prayers, return home to recite them. Right? I don't know what the most amazing part of that story is, whether it was the first election of a sovereign state, whether he was wearing Shabbat attire, whether he was first in line, he was the first person to cast a vote, or whether he actually waited until after he voted to pray, which would normally be the first thing that Moshe Yekutiel Alpert would do in the morning. And, that the moment was so sacred, right? So sacred that he voted first, and then he went home and he prayed. It's an extraordinary sort of first person account. By the way, that day, 87% of those eligible voted. I mean, you might ask yourself, well, what happened to the other 13%? I mean, how did they not vote? But imagine that turnout, 87% in the first election. I've read that many, many times. I've quoted it in sermons. It never ever feels. I never, forgive the double negative. I never not enjoy reading that story, right? Because again, we think of the big miracles, right? The the victory in the War of Independence, the victory of the Six-Day War that I'll talk about in a minute. All these miraculous things, and yet there are like a number of just like everyday mundane miracles that we don't think about as we think about Israel. I'll give you another one: the resurrection of a dead language. The fact that Hebrew is a spoken language today, where people are writing in Hebrew and speaking in Hebrew and composing books and poetry in Hebrew, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's like, a language that was essentially dead. Now, how it happened is a whole nother conversation. Why it happened has a lot to do with creating the identity of the new Jew. But that it happened, and that we take for granted that when we go to Israel, Hebrew is a living language, is just an extraordinary miracle. And I just don't want these kinds of things to be lost as we sort of sketch out, some of these important moments in Israeli and Jewish history. All right. So I begin with that, and now let's turn to. I want to turn to the Six-Day War because as Israel sort of, I don't want to say limps along, because Israel is building a society, but there are challenges, and Israel has some economic challenges in this period of absorbing a large number of immigrants, and there's some really fascinating, important controversies that happen at this time. We're not going to get into all of them. Perhaps another time we can. But we arrive at the Six-Day War in 1967, and Israel is sort of being surrounded by hostile neighbors, and it's clear that Egypt and Syria and Jordan, Egypt in particular, are massing troops. And Israel and actually, I'm more interested in what happened in the aftermath of the Six-Day War than what happened during. I mean, no spoiler alerts. We won that war. It happened really quickly. It was a decisive victory that expanded the territory of Israel significantly. Israel is, Israel reaches out to Jordan, begs Jordan not to get involved in this war. They don't listen. And preemptively, Israel, strikes first, takes out the Egyptian Air Force pretty much in one strike, and cuts off the Gaza Strip from the rest of Egypt. The next day, Israeli soldiers, so this is, what is this, like June 5th, I think, the war begins. And, Israel quickly defeats Jordan. By 11:50 a.m., Jordanian, Syrian, and Iraqi planes are attacking Israel. But over the next 2 hours, the Israeli Air Force essentially disables all of them, disables Air Force bases, and on June 5th alone, Israel will destroy 400 Arab planes. It's dominating the air in that moment. The war is essentially over, right? And what's interesting to me is what happens to Israel in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, because the tone of Israel will change, the spirit of Israel will change, the sense of invincibility sets in Israel, the belief that which will lead to disastrous results, by the way, in 1973, but the belief that Israel is essentially impenetrable. So I want to look at a couple texts together about this, because 67 is significant, because not only does Israel win the Six-Day War, but Israel will expand its territory significantly. So it will take over the entire West Bank. It will, the Golan, will become part of it. The Golan Heights will become part of Israel that they won from Syria. And of course, the Gaza Strip will become part of Israel as well. So the territory is enlarged significantly. And Israel will now be, um, for lack of a better term, occupying these territories, all right? Ruling over people that they don't necessarily want to rule over. And, just to remind you that after 67, Israel went to the Arab League. They sent messengers and really wanted to negotiate. Israel didn't want to rule over the West Bank and thought that this could be an opportunity to negotiate a peace deal. And the Arab League meeting in Khartoum sent back the three famous no's of Khartoum: no negotiations, no peace, no recognition of the state of Israel, right? So again, Israel was ready to return this land and, for the sake of peace. But in that moment, nobody was interested in negotiating for peace. Nobody was interested in even recognizing Israel's right to exist, right? So what happens in the aftermath of the Six-Day War? And I want to connect it to land, to power, to land, and to God, because everything changes in 1967. A messianic fervor starts to kick in Israel. There's an increase in Aliyah after 67, right? People feel like that this is right. This is the moment, right? So 67, as I said, brings this new trinity of power, land, and God. And I want to look at three texts that will capture this, and you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about, which will set the stage for 1973. All right, and the breakdown that happens in 1973. So let me just hold on one second. Let me get to this text. Oh, by the way, somebody asked me about someone asked about the difference between the Irgun and the Haganah. There were three pre-IDF brigades. There was the Haganah, there was the Irgun, and there was Lehi. They were three sort of Jewish clandestine semi-militaristic units in the British mandate in Mandatory Palestine. Ultimately, they joined forces to become the Israel Defense Forces, but there were significant ideological differences in the three. They all believed in the Zionist creation of the Zionist idea of creating a Jewish state, but they disagreed how to achieve it. And the Haganah saw themselves as the legitimate fighting force, and the Irgun and Lehi were they were probably even a little more clandestine. If you think about Menachem Begin, he led the Irgun, sort of a more underground, probably more militaristic. If you watch the show, it's either on Netflix or Amazon, The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. Is it Rosa? Is that her name? Her brother feels like a character modeled after Menachem Begin in the Irgun, right? So we can talk about that another time, but that's the basic distinction, I think, between those three. Okay, so let me go to this text, and I want to look at three texts. All right, the first is a text from 2008. It was a speech by the IDF Chief of Staff Gabi Ashkenazi, and he's speaking at Auschwitz. And I want you to appreciate the language that he uses here. Language that I believe is a result of the Six-Day War, right? The sense of confidence, the sense of power that the Israelis believe they have. All right, with hundreds, and I just shared my screen, with hundreds of witnesses in uniform by my side, joining the thousands of representatives of the IDF who come here every year, commanders of the ground forces, the Air Force, and the Navy, the defending force of the Jewish people, reborn in this land, with tight lips, a coarse voice, and tears in my eyes, yet standing tall. I salute to the ashes of our people and vow never again. We, soldiers of the IDF, emissaries of a country and of a nation, stand here today wearing the IDF uniform, carrying the flag of the State of Israel with pride in the name of the tens of thousands of the IDF warriors and commanders. We consider ourselves the executor of the last will and testament, the dream and the silent prayer of our 6 million Jewish brothers and sisters whose existence was brutally expunged by the Nazi oppressor. 63 years have passed since the end of the most horrible war humankind has ever known. 63 years after the atrocity, the Star of David is no longer a mark of disgrace, but a symbol and a sign of the resurrection of the Jewish people. As the commander of the IDF, the fighting force of the mighty Jewish state, I stand here with pride and honor and pledge, never again shall we stand helpless, crying for the mercy of others. Never again shall we beg to be defended. Never again shall we allow our sons and daughters, our parents and our grandparents to be erased from the face of the earth. Never again shall the frightened eyes of Jewish children look with ghastly dread through the barbed wire fences of the concentration camps. Never. I stand here today in this heartbreaking spot as the commander of the army of the Jewish nation in the name of the Israel Defense Forces. I salute the 6 million Jews who were annihilated by the Nazis and their collaborators. I vow to uphold the responsibility of the IDF never again to allow Jewish blood to be spilled in vain. May the memory of those who perished in the Holocaust be forever blessed and remembered, right? So here you see what I believe is the great transformation post 1967. We are now, Ashkenazi says, and he says this in uniform at Auschwitz, we are now Jews of pride. All right, it's a different Jewish people than pre-67. Right, it's optics, right? That's what the March of the Living, if you know what the March of the Living is, right? People who go to Auschwitz, they, a lot of kids go, a lot of teens. That in a place where Jews march to their death, Ashkenazi stands in Auschwitz in uniform of the IDF. It's a completely different Jew. It's a Jew of power. It's a Jew of pride. It is, in 1967 and the aftermath of 67 that we finally bring to a close the chapter of Jewish history of Jewish victimhood. Now you may push me and say, well, what about 47, right? It feels to me like 67 is the decisive victory that 48 was not. And in that moment, right, it is, we now have the power to back up the claim of sovereignty. All right, there's an army, there's the IDF. It's the army of the Jewish people, and therefore, according to Ashkenazi, the Holocaust will never happen again. There are other examples of this. I'll give you another text. There was a longer text from Netanyahu at the UN, which we won't read, but I'll give you a text from Arthur Hertzberg, the great historian, rabbi, who talks about the tragedy of victory. On June 12, 1967, when the fighting stopped on all fronts, Israel was for the first time the modern heir to David. It had slain visible Goliaths and had defied even larger giants which were lurking behind them. Even non-believers spoke of miracles. In a very deep sense, the exile of the Jews, which had begun with the destruction of the temple in the year 70, ended in the Six-Day War. The victory cured Jews of the shame and powerlessness. Remember last week I spoke about Zionism not just as a movement of self-determination, but for the early Zionists, they considered it a therapeutic movement. The diaspora Jew needed to be cured of the symptoms of the diaspora. And Hertzberg says here, this victory cured the Jews of the shame of powerlessness. They were now admired among other nations. They could admire themselves as a people of valor and of independence. The effects on the self-image and actions of American Jews have been equally striking and just as ambiguous. In the first decade of Israel's existence, support of the state had largely been a private matter, an internal concern of the American Jewish community. When Eisenhower insisted in the winter of '56 that Israel had to back down during the Suez Crisis, something he regretted, by the way, the leaders of the American Jewish organizations preferred to counsel Israel to heed him rather than oppose the wishes of the leader of the United States. By the way, think of what you're hearing today, right? You're starting to hear, certain voices in the government of ceasefire or of pauses, etc. And the Israeli government is saying we will determine when we stop fighting. Since '67, despite the immediate and enormous outpouring of Jewish money, the need for economic and military support of Israel by the American government has become a prime political issue in the United States. It was made so by the organized Jewish community, which had no inhibitions about going public even during the turmoil and disarray of the Vietnam War. The change in the American Jewish policy had something to do with the increasing power and self-confidence of the Jews in American life, but it is undeniable that the worldwide acclaim for Israel in '67 and thereafter added cubits to the stature of American Jews. The Jewish lobby was no longer spoken of in whispers, and its official leaders no longer pretended that they advanced their cause by gentle persuasion. I want to give you one more, because not only did it impact American Jews, but '67 had a significant impact on what will become a major project of the diaspora Jewish world, and that is Soviet Jewry. Sharansky is watching this, as are the refuseniks. And he writes in 2005, "We knew all too well that anti-Semitic stereotypes about greed, parasitism, and cowardice. But what about Judaism, what Judaism stood for? We knew nothing. That was before '67. In the months leading up to the war, animosity towards us reached a fever pitch. Then in 6 dramatic days, everything changed for us. The call that went up from Jerusalem, the Temple Mount is in our hands." If you've never heard that, you got to just Google, Google 6-Day War, Israeli communications, and you'll hear the conversation on the walkie-talkies, saying that the Temple Mount is in our hands. That penetrated the Iron Curtain and forged an almost mystic link with our people. And while we had no idea what the Temple Mount was, we did know that the fact that it was in our hands had won us respect. Like a cry from our distant past, it told us that we no longer were displaced and isolated. We belonged to something, even if we did not yet know what. Of course, we still suffered from anti-Semitism, but even that assumed a new character. Jews were no longer cowards. Instinctively and without any real connection to Judaism, we became Zionists. We knew that somewhere there was a country that called us its children, and this knowledge filled us with pride. So, the 6-Day War wasn't just a war, a victory for the people living inside Israel. It wasn't just a war that expanded territory. It wasn't just a war that, was as decisive as victory as you could imagine. But what it meant to the diaspora, what it meant to American Jews and their own self-image, their ability to lobby, and what it meant to Sharansky and other refuseniks, it set the stage for Soviet Jewry. So it's a very, very important moment. It is important for all kinds of other reasons. The book to read on this, I think, well, there are 2 books. I would say Michael Oren's 6-Day War is one, which will go through the kind of, the military aspect of it, the battle. And Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Like Dreamers, is probably one of the best books of Israeli history I've ever read, which tells the story of, some of the people, some of the soldiers, the paratroopers who fought in that war, and what happened to them, and how the Six-Day War truly changed the fabric of Israeli society. Right? It is, in my opinion, one of the best books you will read about Israel, and the best book you will read about the Six-Day War. All right. Very powerful moment. Again, there's a lot more to say about it, including what it meant for the religious community. The fact that they were digging graves, like 20,000 graves before the Six-Day War. But it was an incredible moment of victory for the Jewish people. All right. Okay, I want to move on and talk about the Yom Kippur War a little bit. Yes, Adrian. And if I don't write them down, we will send out an email with some book recommendations, most likely tomorrow. Okay, trying to manage expectations here. Probably won't get it tonight. Okay, I promise you we will send out a reading list tomorrow. Hopefully, I hopefully promise. How's that? I'm optimistic that we will send out a couple book titles. Okay. Okay, let's talk about the 73 War for a few minutes, because if the 67 War represents the height of Israeli power and belief in invincibility, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, which we just observed the 50th anniversary of, is probably one of the most, well, I would say, up until October 7th of this year, was probably the most traumatic day in Jewish Israeli history. Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. You know what happens on Yom Kippur. Between 60 and 70% of Israeli Jews fast. That's a lot of people. The country essentially comes to a standstill, if you're a bike rider, it's the day that you can actually ride your bike all over Israel, because there are literally like no cars on the road, and you can ride on the highways. If you Google pictures of Israel Yom Kippur bicycles, you'll see like the highways overtaken with bikes. But the war breaks out in Yom Kippur of 1973. It is in many ways a national catastrophe with massive casualties. It left people traumatized, asking all kinds of existential questions. Was this the first war Israel lost? Right? We had won major wars in a short history, so hearing that Israel may have lost was shocking. So just to put it in perspective, right? Prior to 1973, Israel had fought 4 wars in a span of about 20 years. The War of Independence in 1948, the 1956 Suez Crisis, the Sinai War, and the 67 Six-Day War, and the lesser-known War of Attrition between 1969 and 1970. Again, during the Six-Day War, Israel famously struck first. So what happens in 73? What happens is that Israel post-67 had absorbed a new mindset. It was later referred to as the conceptia in Hebrew, the conception in English. It was, what they mean by that is there was this sense of bravado in Israel, a sense of invincibility, that the Arab countries wouldn't dare start another war against Israel. And as some people would summarize at that time, Israel had fallen victim to its own victory in 1967. Now, there was intelligence that something was coming, right? This was not like, there were actually direct warnings about the war. 10 days before the war, Golda Meir, the prime minister at the time, was tipped off by King Hussein that Syria and Egypt, were planning a war. But her senior commanders kind of poo-pooed it and said it's not going to happen. And I didn't see the movie Golda yet, but I assume some people on this call did. And, it tells the story of the Yom Kippur War. The war begins. It's clear that Israel is initially outnumbered. The Egyptians, they blast through the Bar-Lev line within a few hours. Israelis thought it was invincible. And according to Abraham Rabinovich, one of the author of a sort of an important book about the Yom Kippur War, the Egyptians crossed the Suez Canal, and the Israelis were reeling. All right, the Israelis were outgunned 40-1 at the beginning of this war, and the Arab countries rolled out about 2,000 tanks to Israel's 268. In the north, 40,000 Syrian troops and 1,500 tanks stormed the Golan Heights, facing off against a mere 177 Israeli tanks. Hundreds of soldiers were dying per day at the beginning of this war, and there was a real fear of losing this war. Now, again, you have to put this in the context of what happened, 6 years earlier. That conceptia, right? The idea that Israel was invincible. Now, eventually, quickly, Israel figures it out, right? Other countries were joining the war. Israel sort of got their act together and proved that they were still pretty tough. And nearly a week into the war, President Nixon agreed to send a massive shipment of arms and supplies to Israel. This would be known as Operation Nickel Grass. And with new supplies coming in, Israeli tanks pushed Egypt back onto the sands of Sinai. By late afternoon on the same day, Israel had routed the Egyptians. So they quickly turned things around. And by the next night, Israel crosses the Suez Canal and encircles Egypt's vaunted Third Army. They were 60 miles away from Cairo. Okay? So the tides turned. Arab countries, infuriated with American intervention into this war, Israel eventually gets their act together in the north. They were 25 miles from Damascus, right? Which is just, extraordinary if you think about it. If you think about what could have been if Israel would have pushed into Damascus, pushed into Cairo. They didn't, right? They didn't give in to that maximalist compulsion, right? Of wanting to expand the borders in a way that would have been virtually impossible to govern. By the way, one of my favorite stories, Menachem Begin wanted to take tanks into Damascus and get the Jews out of Damascus, load up the tanks with Jews and bring them out, right? Go in, not to conquer it, but to just save, right? Begin loved the Jewish people. He loved all Jews, and he wanted to get them out of Damascus and bring them back to the land of Israel. That also, by the way, did not end up happening. There is, by the way, different opinions about who won the war. Clearly Israel won the war, right? In the sense of, at the end of the day, Israel survived. Israel shot down 430 planes to only losing 100 planes. The loss of soldiers was tragically high. There were 8,200 Arab casualties, almost 20,000 wounded. Israel lost 2,600 soldiers with more than 7,000 wounded. It is, on the one hand, dramatically less than Arab casualties, but more than 3 times the number of Jewish soldiers lost in the Six-Day War. So on the one hand, the experts say that the IDF, the performance in the Yom Kippur War dwarfed the performance of that of the Six-Day War. But ultimately Israel rallied and was victorious. But the Yom Kippur shattered that conceptia, right? It was a shattering of confidence in Israel. There was a little bit of the soul of Israel that was lost there. There was a massive loss of soldiers. I mean, that's a 2,600 soldiers is a lot of soldiers. I mean, we've lost 52 soldiers in this current war, and I will guarantee you that the lines of connection, right, are very close in Israel. Think about 2,600 soldiers dying in 1973 when there were far fewer people living there, and what that must have meant to Israeli society. Um, there was a lot of hand wringing after the war, and you know, that at the end of the day, Golda Meir was sort of absolved of responsibility for the devastating loss, um, but her tenure was essentially over after the '73 war, and I think Israel just had to come to grips with the fact that they were not invincible, and that there was Yom Kippur was a major turning point in the Israel-Arab confrontation. By the way, not always in a bad way, right? Because what happened as a result of the Yom Kippur War? One of the greatest moments of statesmanship in Middle East history, right? Sadat and Begin actually start talking and will sign the Camp David, peace accord in November. What is it? 1978. Excuse me. All right. So, now if you know a little bit of the history, Begin had already made some reach outs, and eventually Sadat agrees to meet. And if you want to read more about this, we will put this on the book list. The Prime Ministers is probably one of the great books of Israeli history, where the author goes into great detail about Menachem Begin and Sadat, which will eventually, as I said, lead to the Camp David Accords. So it's fascinating that what is seen as a devastating moment in Israeli history, right? Even though by most accounts, Israel, by most measurements, Israel was victorious in that war, right? There is a sense that something turned, but it also leads to a treaty with Egypt that continues to hold to this very day. And frankly, it's Menachem Begin, going back to the Irgun that I started with, who was the head of the Irgun, and who Ben Gurion detested, right? Hated Menachem Begin. Begin was seen as as for some he was a terrorist, right? I don't believe that. For me, Begin is one of my heroes. But the man who was seen as a militant, who, by the way, if you knew anything about him, he really wasn't, right? I mean, he fought hard, but he would not fire on Jews, right? There's the famous Altalena incident where Ben Gurion orders Rabin to fire on a ship, on an Irgun ship carrying arms into the Tel Aviv harbor, arms which would go to the Haganah. They fire on the ship, and Begin says, "Do not fire back, because Jews don't kill other Jews." All right. Anyway, I digress on Begin, other than to say that person, right, who Ben Gurion hated and who people thought was sort of outside, some thought were outside the pale, he's the one who makes peace with Anwar Sadat. And actually had a very interesting the two men had a very interesting relationship, and it's worth looking into the prime ministers. I'm having a moment where I can't remember the name of the author of the prime ministers. I'm sure 20 of you at least will write it in the chat, but that is a book that is worth reading about a lot of prime ministers, but in particular, he focuses a lot on, let's see who. Thank you, Yehuda Avner. Thank you, Rivka. In particular, he focuses a lot of his energy on Begin because he was Begin's sort of chief speechwriter and right hand man for a long time. All right, let me give you 5 things to remember about the Yom Kippur War. Number one, Egypt's objective was to regain its honor after its humiliating defeat in the Six-Day War. And it did to a certain degree. Sadat had some street cred to then enter into a conversation with Begin. At the beginning of the war, Israel's existence was in question, right? It looked very bad for Israel. By the end, Israeli tanks were within, kilometers of Cairo and Damascus. Number three, the 1973 Yom Kippur War cemented the American-Israeli relationship. America was the only country to come through with arms for Israel. Number four, the war led to eventual peace negotiations between Egypt and Israel. And number five, even though Golda Meir wasn't officially blamed for the failures of the Yom Kippur War and the failures of intelligence, she ultimately resigned as a result of it. Okay? It's left a scar on Israel, right? I mean, the Yom Kippur in Israel is still heavy with losses from 1973. I saw a question in the chat. Something about Netanyahu. I saw it now. I can't find it. It's a question. It was sort of like, oh, here we go. As Golda Meir took ownership of the failure of the 73 war, do you think Netanyahu will be forced to give up power after this Israeli-Hamas war is over? I don't know the answer to that question, but my sense from being in Israel and reading much of the same news that you are reading is that it's hard for me to imagine Netanyahu surviving this after the war is over. I just can't really see it happening. By the way, today you started to see calls from Lapid for Bibi to step down, and I also saw something today that said if elections were held today, Benny Gantz would dominate Bibi in the polls, right? So it feels to me like BB will go off into the sunset after this war, right? Steve Kessler, go ahead.
Whether Netanyahu steps down, to me, the more fundamental question is, will Israel learn from the Yom Kippur War and the Camp David Accord that for the last 10, 15 years under Netanyahu, but also in the Israeli military, there's been a false confidence and belief that Israel's military strength alone was sufficient to protect Israel. And that if it's amazing to me that Israel stood by and watched Iran successfully place such a large quantity of missiles surrounding Israel, and the US is a complicit in this as well. So my question really is, are the Israeli people going to support Israel trying to be more effective in reaching strategic relations with some of the stronger countries like Saudi Arabia, just like it did with Egypt? Because it's fooling itself if it thinks its military strength alone will protect Israel.
It's a great question, Steve. I would say I always preface this by saying I am not a military expert. I'm just a simple rabbi from New York who, but here's what I will say. Okay. I think that there are a lot of parallels between October 7th and 1973. There probably was a level of concepcia going on in Israel of our technology, our intelligence, the barrier that was created between Gaza and Israel, that nothing like this would ever happen. You're starting to see, of course, news come out that Israel was aware that there was stuff going on the other side, and blah blah blah, and it does feel like the government was caught by surprise with this attack, and someone's going to take responsibility for it. And I would, it feels like Israel was relying too much on technology and um, and intelligence, and not militarily ready to defend. I, I heard Dan Senor speak a couple weeks ago. He just put out another book. He's the guy who wrote Startup Nation. This will be in your book list. He wrote a book called The Genius of Israel, and he was saying that everybody wants the Saudi talks to get back on track. The Saudis want the Saudi talks to get back on track because the Saudis want American protection, and they know that's going to run through Israel. And one of the things that's happening in this war right now, that you'll hear people say, is that Israel has to reestablish itself as a deterrent force, right? Like they have to have a show of force, Steve, here, because the Saudis, think they're entering into a relationship with the superpower of the Middle East and the ones who have the great intelligence. And meanwhile, it's a total breakdown of intelligence. And the army initially looked like it was a deer in the headlights. So one of the things that Israel has to do is to reestablish its military reputation. And I agree with you. I think that these relationships with Arab countries are absolutely critical to the survival of Israel, right? And Iran will do everything they can to try and derail that, which is what we're seeing, right? So we're not going to survive with our military alone. I agree with you on that. But Israel will always have, will always be a strong military presence, I think, and needs to reestablish itself as such, I believe. Any other questions? All right, we're going to go another 2 hours so I can get through Oslo. And no, I actually think that we should keep going for another week of this class, if that's okay with people. I think we do want to cover, it's just too ambitious to think that we're going to talk about the 6-Day War and the 73 War and the aftermath of 48 in 60 minutes. So with your permission, we will send out another date for class 3, which we will cover the Oslo Accords, which will also include the assassination of Rabin, another watershed moment in Israel history, of which Rabbi Solomson, Rabbi Cosgrove, and I were all in Israel. We will not do it on Thanksgiving, Steve, don't worry. So I think Oslo and Rabin are huge, and we also have to understand the emergence of Hamas a little bit to fully grasp what's going on in this moment. Because Hamas didn't appear out of thin air. It's been something that has been fermenting for any number of years, going back, into the early 2000s when they took control of Gaza. Okay, so you'll get 2 things from us in the next 24 hours. You will get a book list with 5 or 6 book recommendations that I think are worth reading, and it's not exhaustive, but it will be cover some of the things we spoke about, and we'll also send another date in the next. It will not be next week, obviously, because of Thanksgiving, but the following week we'll work on with my calendar and Rabbi Solomson's, and we'll get session 3, and we'll communicate with you about the topics of that session as well. Okay, so I want you to know I feel no guilt about not getting through the 4 massive topics, because it just gives us an excuse to keep learning together. And if you have questions, comments, the question about the Irgun and the Haganah came from somebody. So if there are things that you want us to clarify, feel free to send an email to me or to Rabbi Solomson or to Patricia online, and we will do our best to answer them. And again, I look forward to continuing to learn together. So let's be in touch. I wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom and a happy Thanksgiving in advance. And we'll see you soon. All right. Have a good night, everybody. All right.
Thank you.